What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, I want to talk about two people who just thrusted themselves right to the top of title contention at 155 last night. Obviously, Arman Tsarukyan with that brutal finish of Beneil Dariush, and then Jalin Turner with perhaps an even more brutal finish of Bobby Green stepping in on short notice.
Yeah.
And both of these guys, to me, have future champ written all over them. They're both on the right side of 30. They both possess tremendous skills. And in a division where you have the legends like your Gaethje, your Oliveira, your Poirier, kind of picking their shots and doing their thing, you have Conor McGregor looming. I think it makes for the perfect next fight for these two, and it can probably happen sooner rather than later because neither one of them took any damage. And that would be to put Tsarukyan in there against Jalin Turner, and then perhaps you have a new number one contender for the winner of Oliveira versus Makhachev, which we assume that they'll make next.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I think Arman Tsarukyan really did burst himself into the top five. But everybody knows that the top five is moving at a snail's pace right now. Dustin, Justin, Michael Chandler, now Beneil's out of the way. But Islam Makhachev, these guys are strategic with their fights. And while Islam's willing to fight anybody, I don't really see him wanting to just continue to rematch against people, especially Charles Oliveira. That was not a competitive fight at all. And I'd like to see Islam in there with some different bodies, but when you see like Dustin Poirier there and Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler, it doesn't really make sense for them to fight this young, hungry lion. And at the same time, they're all sort of holding out for either Nate Diaz's return or Conor McGregor's return, or the biggest fights that are in some ways bigger than the title fights. And for me, I could honestly see Arman Tsarukyan inserting himself into title contention quickly, but the fact that he just got into the top five tells me he's not going to be fighting people ranked higher than him. That's generally not what happens. Once you steal somebody's ranking, you kind of have to do the favor that they just did for you and go fight somebody that's ranked behind you and just prove that, okay, you're a top five guy. Let's make sure you're solidifying that position in the top five. And so that's why I think Jalin Turner and Arman Tsarukyan is the perfect fight to make. Jalin Turner looked just as impressive as Arman Tsarukyan, but the fact that the rankings were a little bit different, he was 11 fighting 12 and Arman was like 8 fighting 4. And while I'm not the kind of guy that gets hung up on rankings, there is a little bit of that goes into matchmaking and figuring out who's going where. So I think when you look at the top 4, top 5, those guys aren't really going to bite on fighting Arman Tsarukyan anytime soon. They're going to match up with each other. And then when you look at 6 through 10, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for Arman to fight any of those guys. And now with Jalin Turner probably cracking into the top 10, it seems like with them being on the same schedule, with them both getting great finishes, it's the perfect fight to make. And I would just like to see those two go at it because their styles, their body types, everything about them is so completely different that it would probably make for a very interesting top contender fight.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing is both of these guys have a lot of fighting left to do in their careers. Now, Jalin, I think, has a little bit less fighting to do at 155 than Arman Tsarukyan does. I think Arman Tsarukyan is at his appropriate weight class. Jalin Turner is massive. We talked about it last night when we were doing the live stream, the picture of him and Khamzat Chimaev, and he looks bigger than Boris Chimaev, and we know that Khamzat has had trouble making 170. So seeing as how tall he is, how big he is, and especially as he matures and ages a little bit, I think Jalin Turner will naturally find himself at 170 at some point, so might as well make the fun matchups now. But you're absolutely right. When you look at the landscape of 155 and you look at the guys who are the big names, the Gaethjes, the Poiriers, who knows what's going to happen with Conor and Michael Chandler. Those guys are not, they have very few fights left on their schedules for their career, and none of their schedules include, or do they want it to include, Arman Tsarukyan, because he's a massive problem for any of them, and he could defeat any of them, and it doesn't really advance their career to take on this really hungry, up-and-coming fighter. And then when you look for Jalin, he's going to be now into the top 10, most likely, after that win against Bobby Green, and you have Rafael Fiziev, Dan Hooker, there's a few others in there. I'm drawing a blank on some of the names right now, but it wouldn't make sense to put Fiziev with either one of them because he's on a 2-fight losing streak.
Right.
Dan Hooker, he was supposed to be the one fighting Bobby Green. He's going to come back at some point, but to me, it makes sense to put these two young guys in there together and let's see what shakes out. And as you said, Islam Makhachev wants some new blood, and while Jalin would be new blood for Makhachev, Tsarukyan would not. I still think the fans, myself certainly, would be more compelled to see that that rematch rather than an Oliveira rematch or something of that nature because the fight was competitive. It did happen in 2019, I believe, which would have made, if my math serves me, Arman Tsarukyan 23 years old at the time.
Crazy.
So to think that he went to decision with Makhachev at only 23 years of age, certainly you could make the case, especially now as he's gotten 2 knockout finishes in a row, that he has advanced in his skill level and could take on Makhachev as he starts to approach 30 and really come into his own as a fighter. So for me, that's the fight to make. The matchmakers have a hard job most of the time, but this is an easy one for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. And this is a perfect time for Arman Tsarukyan to get another good name like Jalin Turner on his resume. If he's able to beat Jalin, now we're talking about a whole different body type. We're talking about a really lethal striker. I mean, they showed the statistics for Jalin Turner last night. He's no slouch. 11 of his finishes come in the first round of 14 wins, and all 14 of those wins are finishes. So he's a finishing machine. He's exactly what the UFC wants to see in the top of the division. And I think, obviously Jalin Turner is just cracking into the top 10, so he's not really going to jump like Sean O'Malley did. Of course, he's not near the figure that Sean O'Malley is either, but he's not going to jump into the top 3, top 4 like Arman Tsarukyan just did. But I like to believe that Arman Tsarukyan is going to be willing to let Jalin Turner come in and battle for that top 5 spot. And if he's able to do that, we've got a whole new fresh coat of paint at the top of 155. And I think Islam Makhachev likes that. I don't really think Islam Makhachev and the guys that he trains with and the people that he's around all the time want to have easy fights. They want the most difficult fights in the world. They want to prove to themselves every single time they go out there that they are the best in the world. And, like Chael Sonnen, one of my favorite personalities in all of sports, he always says you want to fight the easiest opponent for the most amount of money in front of the most eyes as often as you can, as far up the bill as you can possibly do it. But that's not the method that the team Khabib and Islam Makhachev like to go. They want the hardest fight. They don't really care about the promotional side, and just make sure at the end of the night that people know they are the best fighter in the world. So I think Arman Tsarukyan, while he has a lot of time to, slow down and get to the top of 155, if these older guys that have been at the top for so long want to stay moving at that slow pace and fight each other and just sort of, have these big money fights and red panty night with Conor McGregor, let them go do that. But I could see Arman Tsarukyan really making a straight beeline for the top of the division. And of course, if Jalin Turner gets his hand raised against Arman Tsarukyan, we're talking about a very interesting fight, because I don't think off the top of my head Islam Makhachev's ever fought anybody with the body type like Jalin Turner. To be completely fair, I don't think anybody at 155 has very much experience against a body type like Jalin.
Yeah, I mean, Jalin is going to be a tough code to crack for anybody, as is Arman Tsarukyan. So 155 had a real coming out party last night. Yeah. 2 real contenders and sharp fighters emerged themselves into the conversation. And I love it. Now we have Paddy Pimblett fighting Tony Ferguson coming up. And while I don't think that even if Paddy gets past Tony that he's going to thrust himself into that conversation just yet, he is a big name and he will probably crack the top 10, certainly the top 15 if he's able to get his hand raised against Tony Ferguson. So 155 is, the wheels are turning, but they're turning slowly. But you can't count out the old dogs. We say it all the time. Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, those guys were like, man, they're just holding up the division. And then every time we put them in there with a really good contender, they show us that they still have a lot of fight left in them. So not discounting them, I just think they're all on a slightly different path than some of these younger fighters. And I'm excited for the next 18 months at 55.
Me too. All those guys have every right to be nice and slow at the tail end of their career. If you can get one more fight with Conor McGregor, if you can do some big things, maybe get Nate Diaz back in there, or see if Max Holloway wants to jump up to just give the fans exactly what they want. Those guys are all entitled to that. I think this new wave of fighters at 155 are going to be here for a long time coming, including Jalin Turner, even though he's a big body. I think if the money's right and the title opportunities are there, he'll definitely stick around.
No doubt.